The plan for shelter recovery unfolded during the very hours following the December 7, 1988 earthquake in then Soviet Armenia. In many respects, the immediate recovery efforts were unconventional. Fundamental decisions made about emergency shelter after the earthquake would influence long-term housing recovery and explain some of the conditions we see today. Tents, shipped in primarily from Russia, were placed around the damaged and collapsed buildings, as opposed to the standard practice of establishing staging areas outside of damaged city centers. The result today is that most of the remaining displaced families, mostly living in modified shipping containers and other prefabricated units called domiks, are located in their original neighborhoods of the older city quarters. Perhaps most significant in determining the course of Armenia's shelter recovery was a decision by Moscow in the days following the earthquake that reconstruction efforts would be focused in new city districts to be built from scratch. Soviet President Gorbachev, arriving in Armenia just after the disaster, announced that the Soviet Union would rebuild Armenia's shattered zone within 2 years. Central planning agencies in Moscow subsequently placed large orders with all ministries of construction of the other Soviet republics. Each republic would be assigned a role in constructing the new city regions simultaneously. The rest is history. One of the pivotal events of the 20th century, the collapse of the USSR, paid a particularly heavy toll on Armenia. While great progress was made during the immediate period following the earthquake, steam quickly ran out by late 1991, and with most of the Soviet republics declaring independence, most of the workers packed up and returned to their home countries, leaving behind the cranes and construction materials and unfinished building projects. While a sense of community had been sustained over the years, a subculture of victimization has evolved. The segment of the population remaining in domiks and other temporary shelters, those who had not been fortunate enough to get housing during the first wave of assistance or somehow through their own resources and efforts, showed little signs of being able to help themselves out of this rut.
We were coming up on the 10th anniversary of the 1988 earthquake, and the World Bank, in collaboration with the government of the Republic of Armenia, decided to take a fresh look to analyze and assess the progress to date and to attempt to find some creative ideas for achieving the objectives in a shorter period of time. And it was clear that the approaches and the methods that were being employed and that had been initiated under the former socialist system were not working. They were simply not working. We still had a significant portion of the population in poor housing conditions, in domiks. We also had conditions of the urban environment of the cities that were impediments for broader economic development of the cities and for employment. So it was clear some new ideas, some new approaches were needed. In order to develop the program, we first found the need to analyze the situation in 1998. And what we found were a number of dynamics in place. That there was indeed available shelter, available housing in and around the earthquake zone that was underutilized and poorly distributed. So clearly, while they were not all in the earthquake zone, not all in Gyumri, it told us that there should be available housing today to meet some of the demand of the displaced population. So that told us that firstly, we should look more at a demand side approach, a market side. Historically, since 1988 or 89, really when reconstruction of the earthquake zone started, it was a supply side where resources would be collected, controlled and redistributed. And in all cases, in all the cities, the recovery plan called for pretty much abandonment of the original cities in part or in whole, and development of entire new regions. The new Gyumri, the new Vanadzor, the new Spitak, etc. What had evolved over the 10 years since the earthquake was a transitional period from a socialist to a capitalist economy. And it became clear very quickly that the costs to provide shelter, social services, schools, hospitals, kindergartens, and industrial complexes were not achievable with a simple supply side or new construction. So we took a look, based on experiences elsewhere in the world, of provision of shelter through a market side or demand side approach. And this, in essence, is what we refer to as the economic or the financial component of our strategy. The strategy really has three components: a financial economic, a physical, and a social. The financial economic component was to utilize a voucher system, what we're calling certificates, vagayagir in Armenian, to redistribute available housing stock voluntarily. The population then could assist us in taking surplus housing stock and putting it in the right place, taking people out of their domiks, out of the containers, out of the huts, and into housing that already existed, that was ready, that didn't need to be renovated, and indeed did not need to be constructed. So redistribution of the housing supply in the communities, in Gyumri, in Vanadzor. That was number one.
In 1999, we studied the housing situation, the housing market in Gyumri, and found that despite big shortage of housing resulted in many families living in domiks, there is the average housing supply per capita is not much different of what was pre-earthquake. And the reason is that there is an extremely big difference within Gyumri population with housing supply. Partly this is because many people were leaving the city, and sometimes they didn't know forever or not forever, and they keep their housing. But also the difference between housing among different layers of Gyumri population was extremely high. That was a sign that there is some housing for supply in the market, and if there is enough demand for housing, it could contribute to the solution of the housing problem of the city.
Number two is the social strategy. The system that had been used and continued to be used in part through the entire period is a system of waiting lists that were imposed and implemented through a series of Armenian government decisions. The waiting lists, however, also had a component of the social privileged categories that were really left over from the Soviet period. Military service, service to one's workplace, size of families, etc., all contributed to your place on the waiting list. It was a very difficult system to manage. With our program, what we decided to do was to integrate the social component and the beneficiary selection with this use of the housing certificates.
Եթե խոսենք ընդհանուր When talking about the psychological situation, I can differentiate several phases. The initial phase was lack of confidence that lasted approximately 20 days, starting with our first meeting. During these 20 days, we conducted the first general meetings with the population and had the first orientation meetings, which lasted very long, and we spent a lot of effort to create contact with people and to create confidence. One should be very careful and delicate. Every word would find a reaction, and we needed to be very careful. We could not promise much. We would explain to them that this was difficult work, not mere joy. This was a process, sometimes an unpleasant one. This was the emotional background of the first phase. We had a very delicate approach to all issues. Everyone would agree with me that these people have suffered too long under these conditions and no issue should be left without attention. We might incidentally get off the point of housing certificates and simply talk to people. People were coming up to us to talk. And although we knew they were not eligible, we would always find time to talk to them. Because of all this, we had a very calm social atmosphere throughout the program. I will not conceal that we were afraid initially there would be complaints, since from many Domit communities we selected only a small site and this might bring many conflicts, social stresses, complaints, etc. However, this did not happen, and I want to express my appreciation to the people, since this is a result of their reasonable approach. They realized this was a pilot project and we wanted to test a lot of things. There was a mutual understanding and confidence.
Our center has been involved in two important aspects of this year's pilot program. First, we were responsible for making sure that all eligible households on the selected pilot site were included in the program and that only eligible households participated. We interviewed in depth each and every temporary household on the site, and we visited most households more than once in order to ensure that our information was accurate and up to date and that we had not missed any eligible family. In addition, we mapped all households on the site, whether they were in temporary domics, kindergartens, or in damaged buildings. We also checked government records to make sure that all households met two important criteria for participation in the pilot. First, that they indeed had lost a home during the earthquake, and second, that they had not received any other housing from any other government program or any other program since the earthquake. I must say that we are confident that our data collection methods resulted in the fairest possible distribution of household certificates to all eligible families on the sites.
And combining the social and the financial economic strategy then leads to our third component, which is the physical strategy. So the physical strategy was, let's try to recover the original cities. Let's try to bring back the beauty that once was Gyumri, for example. And the way that would happen would be through a phased site-by-site approach, whereby sites would be selected in the city that had been damaged, but which had the greatest potential for recovery. And by that I meant there may be buildings that were on site, damaged, that could be reinforced and strengthened and returned to the community. In addition to the specific neighborhood and site that we have selected for recovery, there are a number of public buildings throughout Gyumri that have really been held hostage for 12 years because they've been occupied by displaced families. I'm talking about kindergartens and schools and museums and libraries. And part of the recovery process is not only housing, of course, it's also cultural facilities, social facilities, educational facilities. Through the certificate, we've been able to identify 6 or 7, working with the City of Gyumri Council and the mayor, public buildings that are needed again for community use. Certificates were used and are being effectively used to liberate these buildings and returning them to the community, whereby the families in the buildings receive the certificate, and with that certificate they can find permanent housing.
First of all, I would like to mention that USAID really did immense work. There were two factors. First, this was a pilot project and it was necessary to determine the beneficiaries. There were a lot of arguments. Initially, we intended to involve a social group or to employ some other criteria, for instance, those families who had losses. The number of people in these categories significantly exceeded the capacity of our project. This is why we accepted their proposal to implement the program on a specific site. The site was selected so that all the displaced could participate voluntarily. This was one of the activities. After this, the site was surveyed, inventoried of all domiks, and the list of all families were prepared. After this, the project began. The adoption of these new approaches provides us with hope that we shall really implement the Earthquake Zone project. I congratulate all of us on starting the pilot project for this program, because I am sure that this will be continued. I thank the Ambassador, I thank the government of the United States, and all other people who worked for the implementation of this project. Thank you, and please accept my congratulations.
It takes a certain amount of bravery to be the first people in a new program. It takes a certain amount of faith to take a piece of paper and imagine that that's going to turn into a house. It takes a lot of work to go out and look for that house, to find something on the market that's going to meet the needs of your families. And it also takes a certain amount of faith in the government and the people who are making the program happen. And most of all, it takes hope in the future of the earthquake zone and in Armenia. And USAID and all of us here share that hope.
So we have really the intersection of the three strategy components coming together. The financial economic strategy, that is a market-driven, demand-side approach using the housing certificate. It's applied to a physical site, so at the same time, the site is being recovered. And thirdly, and very importantly, when the domik dwellers, the temporarily displaced, have found a home and moved into their new home, the domiks, the shacks, the huts would be removed and they would vanish forever from the urban scape. That's very, very important that the domiks not re-enter a market or a secondary market for reuse and resale. So we recover the city, we rehouse the population, and we make sure that it's a targeted selection of beneficiaries.
What can I say? People have lived in domiks for 12 years, in very bad conditions, and all of a sudden a light appears. People are told they would receive certificates and could buy homes with them. Imagine the happiness this creates for the people, and for the mayor as well. This is a very good program. We are very serious about the domiks. A family will not receive a certificate until they agree to hand over the domik, which is very important. Really, the domiks should disappear from the face of the city. This is the responsibility of the city.
The core of the design, the program design for our pilot, includes demolition of the domiks after the families have been permanently rehoused, and we felt very strongly about this. Here we are actually in the domik demolition yard in Gyumri. And you have to ask the question, if 5 years from now, if we will have been successful in housing the displaced population, if we will have solved the problem only on paper and Gyumri still looks like, quote, a disaster zone, unquote, will we have succeeded? And I think the answer is we will not have succeeded. So we're working with the local authorities really to insist on a very aggressive policy of domik removal and demolition. And what's happening, we've recommended that domiks be cut up, like is being done here, that parts be recycled as metal, that wood be recycled, perhaps distributed or sold to the population for fuel, and that actually reusable or recyclable construction materials be used to improve other person shelter. So domik removal, integral, important to the process.
I had no hope for receiving anything. This seemed coincidental, as by God's will, they came and looked at the domik. People from the Urban Institute had come, talked to me, and went away. I had no hope again, as many times people had come and returned, asked how things are going, and to no use. A month or a month and a half later, after that meeting, they called me for an interview. First time we went in for an interview. The second time, they called me for handing out that thing, the certificate. The apartment has 3 rooms with all facilities. Please, you can come and look at that. I am very happy that they assisted me in this way. I wish for all Gyumri people living in domiks to be involved in this project and to have their own roof, own walls, their own private house. I wish them all good and success to all of you. We sold our apartment, and we are moving to the village of my father. We'll purchase an apartment for an amount less than this, and we will use the excess for agricultural purposes. The transaction took 27 days.
It gives me great pleasure to be here 1 year after we signed the documents and to see the concrete results. And I think the fact that this has been accomplished shows what a true partnership between Americans and Armenians, between the central government, the MARS, the mayor, between government and private sector and NGOs, what it can, and the people of Gyumri can produce.
Understanding that we're not going to have economic recovery overnight, there are things that the donor community can do, that the private sector can do with government in public-private partnerships to start recovery and to show and demonstrate the sense of healing. And that's very important. This site here behind me was covered with domiks just a few weeks ago, and with a fairly modest investment by USAID, we're demonstrating here functional uses. In this case, it's an interim use of a playground. So these are the types of things: landscaping, grading, cleanup projects, playgrounds, and other recreational facilities that are going to start the recovery, going to start the process. And in the future, as the economy improves, as real estate values are enhanced through this process, I think we'll see redevelopment of the types of neighborhoods that pre-existed the earthquake, a mixed-use residential with commercial and support of public facilities and recreation. So I'm very, very happy that we've been able to demonstrate this today. And this is just a small symbol of things yet to come for Gyumri's second renaissance, its future.